Thanks for inviting me here, Marc. I approached this afternoon a little bit like the alcoholic going to the AA meeting. I wasn't really looking forward to it, and then to my joy I arrived, and it's much more like the addict with all his dealers present. So I'd like to start by thanking Jerry Long for allowing me full access to Sir Edward Sullivan's rubbings, Elizabethanne Boran, who searched for a very elusive duck and found it in one of her bindings, Maura Kennedy, who allowed me full access to all of her bindings, and Jason McElligott and Julie Cummings, who have knocked me back on my heels with the riches that are up in the Farmley Library. As in AA, you start by announcing what you are. I am a book collector. I have a very indulgent wife who allows me to collect a lot of books and build a room to house them. I'm even so addicted to books that I use them to frame some of the talks that I give. And I wasn't aware that I was going to be introduced as a physician. That was supposed to be a big surprise, that why would I be talking to the Nurses Alumni Association, Rhode Island Hospital? Well, I was talking about advances in the area that I really work from 9 to 5 in, which is radiation oncology. That is, a guy who treats cancer. And the big change that has happened in my life since I left UCD, here we have a plain ordinary chest x-ray, and believe you me, if you look very, very carefully, you can see a tiny little shadow up there, an old standard x-ray that was around for many, many years. And then along came CAT scans, and CAT scans are absolutely magnificent things because that little shadow that you saw, in fact, was a bloody great big lump. This is a CAT scan across the top of the chest. You have the shoulder, left lung, right lung, and there's the tumour. Another one, this one's even more dramatic. This poor chap had a tumour here, and it's invading and destroying the vertebral body. So he's got bone destruction. Bone is going to collapse fairly soon, but even more worrisome, it's encroaching right on the spinal cord, which is that little round thing there. If you do a PET CT, which is injecting radioactive substance which goes to tumours, you can see how extensive the tumour actually is, and there are even satellite nodules out here. Which leads me to what I actually spend my days doing. I spend about half my time seeing and talking to patients and supervising staff, and the other half of my time is in front of computer terminals, carefully outlining target volumes, either targets that we want to hit with a certain dose or targets that we want to avoid. In that particular case, we wanted to give a very significant dose of radiation up here, and we wanted to avoid the spinal cord. So I spent my whole time doing that sort of thing, which suited me peculiarly for what I do as a hobby or as an avocation. In 1922, the 4 courts went up in flames during the Civil War, and with them went up 149 volumes. And these volumes were about 22 inches high by 15 inches wide, and they were the wonder of the bookbinding world. They were world famous, they were exquisite, they were magnificent, and they all vanished. Fortunately, a chap by the name of Sir Edward Sullivan had taken photographs of about 20 of them. That's one of the photographs in the National Photographic Archive, Lord's 1697, and remember this thing is 22 inches high. And he did rubbings, pencil rubbings, wax ball rubbings of all of the others, all 149 of them. And this is an undoctored photograph of the volume MS 3017. I know it so well from so many times I've signed it out, of the rubbings of the rest of the parliamentary journals. So I thought to myself, well, you have a lot of experience sitting in front of computer terminals and outlining things, so maybe if you started, instead of just collecting books all over the place, you concentrated on collecting Irish 18th century bindings, you might be able to find the tools that went to make the original parliamentary bindings. Because surely the bookbinders who did the parliamentary bindings didn't just do those, they also did other works. And this is one example of a Dublin binding about 1740, 1750. That's the sort of thing I've done with abstracting or extracting the tools. Another example, And yet another example. And what you can do is you can blow these tools up on a computer screen if you've scanned them in at high enough resolution and pick out the details. And my original idea was that I'd take some of the photographs and I'd superimpose the tools on them. But just like Sullivan in 1904, 1906, all I was going to be left with was a picture. And that was rather disappointing, and was also very, very tedious work. It took me 4 hours to get to that point. 4 years, I beg your pardon. 4 years. I beg your pardon. It took me 4 years to get to that point. Then, very fortunately, I was introduced to this chap. And that chap is Trevor Lloyd. He's a bookbinder, book finisher in England. And he was commissioned to do a repair job on a lot of Irish bindings in a private library down south. And he and I got together and I started showing him all the high resolution scans I had done. And he was acquainted, or knew very well, this man here, Stuart Field, who is a machinist, inventor, a marvellous man. And this is one of his Heath Robinson machines here. He lives in Bristol, and he manufactures and makes all these things himself. They are computer driven, but they're also full of eccentric cams and all sorts of weird things. And he's able to produce these tools. This is out in the outhouse. He has 3 little wooden sheds out in the garden where he makes these things. And the end result was we were able to produce the first of the reproductions of the parliamentary journals. Magnificent piece of work. It's very intricate, very nice looking there. There's about 25,000 individual tool impressions on that particular book. Then we got very ambitious and did this one, which is Lord's 1753. Which has a most unusual feature of marbled paper onlays, white paper onlays, and then this particular thing here called featherwork, close-up of it. That particular binding has a total of 17,900 individual tool impressions. It took about 2 years to generate all the tools between scanning, drawing, locating, machining them, and it took Trevor about 4 months to actually do the binding. Not 4 continuous months, but 4 months on and off, because you just can't do that work for more than a few hours per day. That's to give you some idea of the actual scale of those books. Problem is, how do you find shelf space for them? Now, I was actually supposed to tell you about a dateline of design and materials, so let's quickly run through some materials. Most Irish 18th century bindings are calf, brown calf, with or without blind tooling, as you see here. Sometimes some of the early ones with some gold tooling. But the ones that have survived, because they're nicer, are these red goatskin bindings. A lot of them in Trinity prize bindings. There you have an example. That one was given out in 1733. So this is one of the very earliest. In fact, we suspect it's number 4. This is the very earliest of the prize bindings. Another one from Trinity. I think this is 1740 about. 2-volume set. Again, Trinity prize binding. And then a bespoke binding. Next binding is a little bit unusual in that it is green vellum. There's a lot of discussion in the literature that the Irish vellum bindings were very famous. In fact, they were so famous that Horace Walpole wrote over from England saying, could he have some of his books bound up in green vellum in the Irish way? And some of the standard books say that, yeah, this is right, they were famous, but they're very rare. I don't think so. I think we just haven't looked hard enough, because that's an almanac from 1768, I think. That's probably an Irish binding. I haven't proven the case yet. It's a London printing, but it has an Irish provenance in that it's Dr. Mayharg, who was a physician in County Carlow in the late 18th century. And it was given to him by a Colonel Henniker, who was also in Carlow at the time. This one is most assuredly Irish. It's on Maffet Sallust, and this one is up in Farmley. An absolutely magnificent piece of work. It's a vellum binding with every known Irish tool on it. And then, of course, when you get to the Victorian era, they put everything they could on books, bone, everything, and then bog oak. This is an example of highly carved bog oak put on as a cover. But the great majority of Irish bindings from that period are, in fact, plain calf, marbled quarter calf with marbled boards, or just blue sugar paper boards, pasteboard with blue paper over them. Endpapers. Great majority of endpapers, plain white, usually a laid paper with chain lines running either vertical or horizontal. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to the way in which they're put, but frequently they have nice annotations on them. Vitally important that that stuff is recorded, absolutely vital. Too often, if you send a book to a binder to get cleaned up, they'll lose this stuff on you. So you have to send written specifications with the book. And I had a copy of Buckley's Cyrus first mention of tar water, and it was Cushing's copy. Cushing, the famous neurosurgeon in Boston, it came back to me without Cushing's bookplate. Fortunately, they kept everything and found it, so it's back in the book, but I had a hard time for a few days. Dutch marbled paper, very common in Irish books in the early to mid 18th century, and this one exemplifies one of the problems. It's a large book from Farmley, from the Farmley Library, and you can see there's a paper join here. It was very difficult in the 18th century to get paper big enough, or marbling baths big enough to do a sheet of paper that would fill a folio book, so you'll frequently see them joined. French splash, also see that. Ornate blue papers, silk moiré, you'll also see. Design. I want to just go back a little bit for a second. One of the contentions also is that most marbled papers, most decorated papers in this country were imported. I think that also needs to be re-examined, because if you look at books that have had their edges marbled, that has to be done at the time that the book is bound. So if you can find a book with edge marbling of an early enough date, then you can start to say, oh, we probably were doing our own marbling here. And in fact, I have a small 3-volume, 16 Mo History of Peter the Great, and lo and behold, it has marbling on the edges. Only copy I had until last week. I came across a large folio in Farmley, 2-volume set, and it has, most unusually, it has marbled edges with gilt over it, as you would in a 4-edge painting. But it's contemporaneous with the book, which is about 1745. Design. Irish bookbinding design, basically, we got a lot of our ideas from England, from Holland, and from France. Some peculiarities of the Irish bindings. The central lozenge or medallion, usually made up of many, many, many small tools, and usually quite irregular. You'll see some in French, you'll see some English Harleian central lozenge bindings, but the Irish ones are exuberant and pretty hard to miss. Paper onlays were also relatively common on Irish bindings, and sometimes even leather onlays, such as you see here. And this is a typical example of a really exuberant Irish binding. This one, I'm sorry you can't see it in full size, because this is actually a 15-inch book where the lozenge has taken over the whole darn cover. The other characteristic of Irish bindings that you will sometimes see, in fact you'll see it very rarely, but when you do see it, it's striking, and this use of repeated gouges, curved tools that are put in repeatedly to imitate the look of featherwork. That's one, a Baskerville Book of Common Prayer. That's another Baskerville, the Greek Testament, and the Prize of All. That again is also from, sorry Jason, I'm stealing all your slides. This is again from Farmley. It is the most spectacular binding this side of Bonnet's work in the 20th century. But up to Paul Bonnet, this and a companion volume in the Chester Beatty on Vitruvius, the two most spectacular bindings you will ever see. Some comments. Do I have time for comments? Yeah. Okay, some time for comments. One of the things that interested me in this talk about digital design and digital printing, and I have commissioned both hot letterpress books and digital books, we forget how much time that standard letterpress typography and printing had to work on its problems. This is an interesting book that I bought, which basically says, please don't bind this book for a year. And the reason? It was a very early, 1780, it was a very early colour printed book. And the problem was the colour inks wouldn't dry. And a book that's bound up gets a lot of pressing and banging and all the rest of it. And you see offsetting of the ink onto the opposite side. So really we're in the very early phases of digital printing, and we're spitting ink at paper instead of impressing ink into paper. So it's going to take a little while to get the papers to match. They had 400 years to match the paper to the ink and to the pressure. So, patience. This is another delightful farmley binding. It's a one of Grierson's small little 12-mode classics, 1727, I think. Fabulous little binding. I wonder, did the designer of that Christmas tree ornament see that binding? Go back again. So, don't throw your old books out. You might get some very nice new design ideas. One aspect of bookbinding or book production that I think we haven't covered so far today is the tactile nature of bookbinding. That's a copy of the St. Cuthbert's Gospel. Dates from about 800. As you all know, it was found in his coffin when they opened it up in the year 1000, and they needed to improve the tourist revenues in Lindisfarne, so they made a big deal about it. That's apologies for the amateur nature of it. I did this in a class given by Kristen Rose, and I think Jim Bloxham. Isn't Kristen Rose at the Chester BT now? I think she is. That's an example of what they did to give a tactile cover to books in the 8th century. How did they do it? They had leather, they had quarter sawn beech boards. They put on bits of leather, they put on bits of gesso, and they put on bits of cord. I'd ask you to be sort of delicate with this one. It's a teaching model, and it shows how the whole thing was put together. Because part of the charm with the particular type of binding that was common, and I'm sure it's what was on all of our manuscripts, was that they had Coptic sewing. They had no sewing supports, and the book opened very, very flat and very, very nicely. That's a teaching model that was finished last month by Marc Esser, who's a fantastic bookbinder in Boston. If you take also the information that on the Psalter, the Fadon Psalter, that they found some papyrus in the actual wrap, I think it's pretty clear that there were significant Coptic influences on what was going on here in the 8th century in terms of bookbinding, etc. That's the one that's being handed around. Lastly, anyone read that article in The Economist? No, okay. It's the MakerBot movement. This is UCD, for God's sake. No? Okay, the engineering department. In days of yore, when you wanted to make, in Victorian times, when you wanted to make an embossed cover, you got somebody to engrave a great big brass plate, and you put it in a press, and you impress the leather like so. I purposely chose the cathedral one because there's a little cathedral. And I purposely put the little cathedral beside some printing stuff. That's printer's furniture, by the way, for those of you who don't know about hot press, letterpress printing. And there's an Albion press, and there's our little cathedral still. And what's unusual about the little cathedral is, in fact, it's made of bits. And those bits were printed. There are now printers that instead of spitting out ink, they spit out plastic, or porcelain, cement, or whatever you want. And layer by layer by layer by layer, they will build up a little three-dimensional object for you. So in future, instead of having to go beautiful book cover like that, which is done by heavily embossing with one of those engraved plates, you'll be able to use perhaps 3D printing for your book covers. And lastly, a plea for crosstalk. We all need to talk together. Where do we get these design elements? Anyone know what that is? It's a thing called a balance bridge, and it's about 3/4 of an inch from here to here, and it covers the little wheel that spins in a watch. And in the 18th century, they had a fusee movement, very delicate, needed to be protected. So we had 3 little screws going in here, and the pivot went there. And what's amazing about them is they're all heavily ornate. They've got lovely little engravings on them. So I suspect that the same people that were doing this little miniature work were also the people who were cutting and engraving the bookbinding tools that were used to impress all those. Gold tooling, by the way, is done by you put down a layer of egg white, you put down foil, you press a heated stamp like that, and then you got your thing. That's actually an Irish one, as you would guess, with the harp. And this one I'm particularly fond of because it was made by Mr. Maddock in Watford in about 1790. That's it. Thank you very much.